get started. Can everybody hear me? Yep. All right, so all the lonely people in the back, I'm going to invite you to come and move forward and make some friends. It's a Connect conference, so let's try to get some connections going. 2 people are moving. 3 people. Keep it coming. All right. So as these folks are settling down, I'm going to set the scene a little bit. We've got a very exciting session coming up. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm the new Chief Digital Officer, and I am particularly excited about this session because we're going to get some tips and tricks on how to run a government that is increasingly, I think, mainstreaming digital. So the name of our session now is Government Unusual. Is that right? Government as Unusual. And we're going to hear from 2 fantastic speakers about what the future is of government, how governments can mainstream digital practices. When we talk about digital government, we didn't talk a lot about definitions this morning. It's essentially the idea that we can adopt modern tools from the internet age, from the 4th Industrial Revolution, to try to make government serve citizens more effectively and deliver services that people trust and are excited about. So that's the opportunity that we're looking at here. As governments increasingly adopt digital strategies, we're realizing that it really does require a deliberate investment to make this all work. So I'm extremely excited to introduce 2 speakers who are going to help us understand some of the things that governments can be doing to deliver better services. So our first speaker is going to be Honey Dacanay, who is from the Ontario Digital Service. She's one of the founding members of the Ontario Digital Service. She currently serves as the head of digital standards and governance. And one of the very exciting things to come out of Ontario in recent months is an exciting piece of legislation around delivering better, faster services to Ontarians. So we'll hear about all that from Honey. We're also going to hear from Katherine Benjamin. Katherine is the VP of Service Design at Ayoga, which is a targeted healthcare initiative. I think together we have a really interesting opportunity to learn from our experts around how we can build and mainstream practices for the digital age. Here in BC, we often talk about having the courage to regularly release code often, and then the discipline of imposing cultures and processes on ourselves to make that a viable effort on a go-forward basis. So we're going to have some insight on how to make that happen from other jurisdictions and other perspectives. Honey, come on up.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thanks everybody. A real pleasure and honor to be with you today. Okay. I'm really nervous. I just realized. No pressure. Okay. And so I work on digital standards and governance in the Ontario Public Service, and more specifically the Ontario Digital Service. And I normally call that title sort of the resident wet blanket in the Ontario Digital Service. No, you can't do that. This is not how anybody will understand us in the rest of government. They'll think we're a bunch of hippies who just trying to change things and introduce new buzzwords without actually changing anything. The other title that I go by is Chief Bureaucracy Hacker or Whisperer. And I kind of prefer that title because it sort of talks about how we really want to change things in government. Speaking of titles, this particular title is something I'm also really drawn to because we do live in unusual times in terms of the digital government movement all over. I think there is broad appreciation that we do need to enter the digital era, and this broad understanding that a digital government office and every government needs to exist. However, what we haven't figured out yet is how deep will this transformation be? And what's before us, as David Eves, and who is from Vancouver, BC, had mentioned, is that long, slow battle over the size and shape and structure of government as we know it in the years to come. And so, no pressure, that's really where we're at. I tend to compare the digital government transformation journey with the Theseus Paradox. Quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with this? Okay, awesome, I see a lot of hands. And I always talk about I think about the things that we're trying to do as distinct planks. For example, if you're at the end of your journey, is it still the same ship if you change one thing at a time? And because our end game for digital government is just government, that's also why I like to think about this metaphor. Would we recognize ourselves in the end? And so the first plank we introduced in Ontario is Ontario's Digital Service Standard. And so it will be similar to a lot of the standards that you've seen in every other jurisdiction in the world that has created a digital government office. Ours was published within the first 30 days, pretty much, of being established. And so it's meant to be a set of new defaults. This is how we want to work now. We wanted it to be the new minimum bar for all services, or for just how it is like to be a public servant in a digital age. And so I'm not going to go over each principle. We started it, but the main things around this. We started talking about user research and the importance of understanding and hearkening back to our call as serving the public. We started talking about how we work and trusting each other again in agile, multidisciplinary teams. And then we started talking about open standards, common platforms, privacy and security, which things that are usually afterthoughts when we work with technology. And so we put this up back in 2017, and my biggest fear, to be honest, was that we would treat it just as another thing that we launched. In fact, I was talking with a few public servants from BC with that same problem. If we are doing this well, we're not launching, it's just another day at work. And this is really the nightmare of every change management initiative. Is government working better yet? Because every day when you set up a new office, there's also that question, what have you changed exactly? And to be honest, if you're somebody who works behind the scenes and you're not part of a delivery team, what value do you bring to this? I'm about to unpack that. And so a typical public sector reform initiative usually has the following change management playbook. And so I always talk about this. Act 1, there's a high-profile announcement or a giant memo that gets issued from somebody very powerful announcing a new executive, a new initiative. Here we go. We're going to change how we work. It's usually followed up by a really wonderfully robust communications plan and a roadshow deck. There's always a deck. You never get away from the deck. And then there's also a pilot project, a gold-plated one that's exempt from all the rules, just so that it's all protected. And we'll talk about what we learned. And then sometimes if you don't get the pilot project, you also have the mandatory training. Everybody will have to take this. Learn the new buzzwords. That's also another favorite. And then a month after, or maybe a few months after, when the shininess has gone down, there's a spreadsheet or a tracking form that comes out from one executive office to all the different departments. Tell us how you complied. And then our KPI is usually the number of mentions and instances that you see the words user research or agile in every decision or proposal document that you complete. And God help us, this is not what we want. We do want the changes to be a lot bigger. And I really think we've been going about change management the wrong way because of this. And if Alex is in this room, he will probably disagree and probably get me thrown off stage. But I honestly believe that if we are going to change government, we need to start thinking of government and bureaucracy as a feature, not a bug. We need to understand government and talk about aligning interests that might be different, appreciate the complexity and the constraints. I remember when we were talking earlier that most of you are public servants. And so everybody has a role in this, and nobody's exempt from this mission, which means we actually need to take the time to understand what we're trying to do. And so I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation mostly talking about How do we change the actual bureaucracy from within, one plank at a time, the way we would normally do things, the government way, and reorient how we work and introduce the new status quo, the new inertia? And so the first will sound really basic. Learn how government works. And so every good public servant will know, for example, we will read the annual report, we will look at all the corporate communications, look at look at the government directory, figure out where power and influences are. But the other side of that is to actually start to talk to other departments, have those conversations, have those informal chats with everybody. And because this journey is now something that spans across boundaries, we actually need to talk to more people and actually engage about what does it mean to run a government in a digital age, because this is the question grappling us, that we need to grapple with. Need to embrace the chaos and complexity that's around us and actually just feel comfortable with being overwhelmed. And I know that sounds too basic, but some of it also includes what are the processes, what are the rules versus what is lore. In every bureaucracy, we need to understand the nuances. Where and how does money flow? And who the decision makers are and who are the top influencers around them? What is the difference between the rhetoric and the reality? And of course, the mechanics of formal and informal decision making, whether it's good, bad, and ugly. We need to learn about it dispassionately. And it's because if we don't understand it, we don't know what we're changing. So I'm showing two process charts from Ontario. The image to the left is just the government decision-making flowchart and how a cabinet submission travels all the way through decision-making. The one to the right is a very old flowchart showing how IT projects get funded and approved through Treasury Board and technical reviews. I'm showing this primarily just to illustrate that this is the happy path and the clean path, by the way, when people show this. And it's fine. I'm actually not even judging it for that is. What it's telling me is that decision-making is fragmented and complex. And depending on the type of decision you're seeking, you need to follow a different path. Each path has its own secretariat, template, structure, and a set of jargon and rules. And then usually there's a group of subject matter experts who write the decision document, and they have nothing to do with the group that gets to implement whatever decision gets made. And then of course, that just gets papered over. Again, process style, so it is assembly line government essentially. And then of course, decisions for the government's most important things are pretty much made at a time when you know the least about the problem you're trying to solve, the people most affected by it, and then of course, the technology costs and impacts. And so, you need to understand that kind of level of minutia to also know what you're trying to change, because otherwise we won't know we'll always be scratching at the surface in terms of changing how government works. And so I usually share this very uncharitable picture of the public service and the poor public servant behind the counter. And to be fair, everybody always talks about why is government so slow? And so at one point, the Ontario Digital Service was housed within the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services. And so we became responsible for Service Ontario. And also, to this day, the Ontario Digital Service is responsible for pretty much rebuilding Ontario's top 10 high-volume transactions run by Service Ontario. And so I always talk about if we're just looking at it at surface level, and this is exactly the reason why people will go to their MPPs to complain or their councillors. And why is this hard to unpack? And every public servant should probably have at their disposal for something even as innocuous as changing your address. How many departments are involved in this? How many forms? How many approvals? How many systems does this person have to enter everything into? How many forms does this person have to fill out in order to even just get that stamp? What happens if it's a complex transaction? How do you even calculate the cost depending on the different departments? And all of that is worth understanding. Yes, to build empathy. Two, if you work in a digital service, you actually become a very credible change agent because you're able to articulate different pains and understand the problems and constraints that government has to work with. And finally, because you understand the organization, and it's not for the faint of heart to actually arrive at how complex and sometimes disastrously complicated things are. That's how you end up having the confidence to do the next part, which is ask the awkward but very critical and important questions. And so this is my favorite question to ask. Every senior leader is something, I hope that every public servant will always have the courage to ask, how much are you ready and are willing to change? Because this is something I ask, and it's something I renew as well in every opportunity with our political leaders, with our own senior leaders. Most of the time, so this is pretty much an okay-ish textbook version of how government works, and so policy and delivery assembly line style evaluation. And usually digital fits in this very tiny purple circle around delivery implementation, and we're sort of cast in this very defined role. But sometimes you actually need to broaden the scope of that, and so we need to ask again, how much are we willing to change? Because our actions and what we end up doing, the projects we take on, and the extent to which we're willing to change this whole paradigm here and reset the relationship between policy, delivery, and evaluation will really help us understand how deep this transformation can go. And then, of course, what are the trade-offs? I could spend a whole other hour, which I won't, on how we don't talk often enough about the trade-offs that we make with every policy choice, with every technology choice. And so I'm using, for this particular slide, I was talking about the digital service standard and where we cast it. Is this part of, it's no longer necessarily just about corporate policy, because it sort of sits in the middle, similar to the Public Service Act or privacy laws, because while they dictate operations of government and the public service, it also has wide-ranging public impact. Once you have that buy-in, move at the speed of trust. Don't waste a moment. If there's a reason I'm slightly incoherent, it's because I'm probably tired, because I'm definitely not wasting a moment trying to make sure that we've earned that buy-in and that we also act on what's available, especially if there was readiness to change. And so among the things that have been changing and have been privileged to lead are a lot of machinery of government reform, things that would help us sort of do this at scale. And so recently the government introduced something called the Simpler, Faster, Better Services Act. And so this was introduced as part of our spring bill and proclaimed in August 2019. Now, an act doesn't magically change the world. However, it signals that this is how we want to work, and we are serious about it. So it's not just best practices anymore. And so what does it do? It codifies in statute certain principles in our digital service standard. And so user-centered design, inclusive design, privacy and security, building on scalable interoperable platforms. Continuous improvement is the other thing. As part of that legislation, we also introduced a new policy actor into the space, the Chief Digital and Data Officer. So Deputy Hartley, my boss, is pretty much now our first Chief Digital and Data Officer. And her mandate is to pretty much set standards, enforce those standards, and also drive digital and data transformation in Ontario. As part of our call out, we also updated a lot of outdated legislation and internal rules. We did a call out across government ministries. We informally called it the No More Excuses exercise. It's our way to talk about it, because it's usually the case that we hide behind, oh, but the law says this. But right now, because we're able to have the courage to say, how much are you willing to change? This became part of the table. The next few slides are early day slides, and so this is work we're doing in progress. Also very cognizant of the fact that the talk is being live streamed, and so let's have an offline chat about a lot of some of the progress and how things are going. But some of the things that are underway include our assessment process that we're trying to integrate with our Treasury Board process, and so orienting funding around the service design lifecycle. And then the other side of that too, though, is building a learning organization. So making sure that training and coaching and the actual supports for leaders and teams are available so that these new ways of working actually thrive. And then we're also applying our own medicine on ourselves when it comes to providing governance and decision making. I'm a machinery of government nerd and decision-making nerd, and so we needed to do service blueprinting exercises, even with our own governance committees, to just show what does internal red tape look like and the impact on public servants. And so that cleanup is still underway, but that's still kind of it's something we recognize as something we do need to tackle. And so in terms of introducing a new status quo, this is my humble playbook, essentially. And so it's still a work in progress, and the growing hypothesis, hopefully, is that by the time we're finished, I won't recognize the government or the public service that I went into. Anyway, happy to chat. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Awesome. All right, so bringing us up for the second part of our talk here. Hello, my name is Katherine. I'm going to chat with you for the next just under 15 minutes because I understand I have a hard stop and I need to get people to their next session. Might go a little bit over. I see that I have a 5-minute warning. So feel free to duck out if you have to get to your next session. But I want to talk a little bit about how we operationalize some of the things that Hani described. And so I often like to show this quote from Margaret Mead, who talked about what people say, what people do, and what they say they do being entirely different things. And specifically, this is relevant to digital transformation in government because the challenge we have operationalizing user-centered design in government systems isn't just challenging because it's hard to know what users want, but also because no matter whether we're government or a health system or a private organization, trying to marry up what that user wants with what our organization is trying to achieve is actually very difficult to do. And this can be difficult from both an operational and strategic sense. And so I want to give a case study of an actual, real user-centered design process as a means to tell you a bit about a framework that can help you think about how you might bring some of this into your own organization. And so this story is about an actual government-funded project in the NHS in England, the National Health Service. So Open Doors, where I used to work in 2013, is a clinical outreach and case management service. And we provided services for people involved in street sex work. And we were brought in to take over for a failing service. And so in 2013, the first thing we did was go and speak to that service and understand, why is it that you think that people aren't coming to your service? And what we heard from that service provider was, well, you know, our service users are very hard to reach, and people have to really want to make a change. And we thought this was a little bit of an unusual answer, because at Open Doors, we did things differently. So at Open Doors, one of the first things we did was start doing outreach in the middle of the night. This was important because what we learned was that the users were primarily nocturnal. So doing an outreach that's operating in the daytime, as things had previously been done, obviously wasn't working. So we drove around the streets in the middle of the night and we spoke to people and we said, what are your needs? What's a priority for you? And the first thing people said is, I need access to methadone. And it was a little bit odd too, because there was a methadone service down the road. But what we learned about that service that wasn't working was that it often took 6 weeks and 3 appointments to get your methadone prescription. And if at any point in that 6 weeks you missed an appointment, well, that's a problem. You have to start again at the beginning. So in practice, the service design for that target population made it impossible for the very users to access the service that they needed. And I tell this story not to give examples of bad service design, but actually because of what our boss did next. So I worked for a really innovative leader named Georgina Perry, and the very first thing she did was go in and meet with all of the leaders in this space, and she said, right, you lot, in the next couple of days and weeks, we're gonna sign a new service level agreement, and here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make it so that every single time our service, Open Doors, brings in a patient, they're gonna be seen that day. We're gonna sign the paperwork, it's gonna be put in our service level agreement, done. And that's what happened. So for someone like me, who works at an operational level, that's a huge thing because it unblocks us and it gives us a framework for action. So suddenly, I could now drive around in the middle of the night, and when I spoke to people, I could say, okay, I can see that you are busy. It is 2 o'clock in the morning, but how about at 8 o'clock, you come meet us at our breakfast drop-in service. We'll cook you up a breakfast, we'll give you some coffee, and at 9 a.m., you and I will go together to the methadone clinic, and I promise you, you are gonna leave today with that methadone prescription. That's a service guarantee, and it was absolutely outrageous. Nobody believed us. People were like, yeah, okay, sure, your service does that, whatever. But a couple people took a chance on us, and very quickly word of mouth spread. And what we were able to do was demonstrate that our organization did what it promised to do. So why do I tell that story? Because the work that we're often having to do isn't complicated, it's just hard. And this also explores why it's so important to have that top-down cover. People coming in, providing air cover for people operating at a more operational level to do their jobs well. And so like Honey, I'd like to showcase a process that exemplifies that. So you can see what happened there is that Georgina came in, she met with the leaders, they removed the blocker, and this enabled us to show our work rather than just tell people and talk about how great our service is. And you actually see that same process in place in Ontario. Here we had top-down support from Deputy Hartley and Minister Matthews. What that enabled us to do is things like our digital service standard and our user research guides. Those are the frameworks we need for action. Again, when we have a framework in place, we can remove the blockers. They signed off things like our business cases, so we could pay participants for their time, so we could recruit the right people, so that we could have a constant stream of people coming through to do our user-centered design practice. And that enabled us to show our work rather than just telling people about how great our user-centered process was. So specifically, in addition to writing the user research guide, we were running things every single week, user testing, actual sessions with people, informing our product design, and then simultaneously running drop-in sessions to treat other people about what we were doing. And so I've provided a really light touch framework, partly because you're at a conference like this and you have to give like really succinct answers to things. But one thing that I've overlooked, and one of the key takeaways I want to leave you with, is, as Honey referenced, the importance of asking those really awkward questions. Because this framework does hold, but you can't do it in a way that gives you permission to not think critically about things. So by that I mean, what happens when what the user wants and what the system wants are not the same things? I asked this earlier, but I want to be more specific about exactly what I mean. So in many cases, you're going to see this tension where we treat our design process as though user-centered design is apolitical. We sanitize the process. Design is never apolitical. Design is political work. So it makes it really difficult for us to do our work in government because we're negotiating really complicated territory. We talk about the notion of empowerment in digital government transformation. This idea that if citizens and people engage in digital services, it will give them a greater ability to participate in government decision-making. And while that can absolutely be true, it's important to remember that empowerment is about power. User-centered design is about redistributing power dynamics within a system of organization. And so when you do that, you'll find that your users don't always do exactly what you want them to do. And what does that do for your service? And finally, evoking David Eves from Harvard, as Honey did, what happens when you win? What happens when you do excellent government digital transformation and you're so good at it that you haven't actually slowed demand or reduced costs for the service? You've actually made the service so easy to use that you see an uptake in service usage. That's really problematic if you're funded from the perspective of cost savings. So I'm afraid I don't have all the answers, and in conclusion, I do have a call to action for you, and that's to think back about the framework that I described, and to think of it not only as something to use when you're thinking about product design, but actually as broader systems change. So it's not so much a hierarchy or a stepwise process as a cycle. This is to say that if you're feeling stuck, if you're feeling like you're in a situation where you're not getting that top-down support, return back to the idea of showing work and not telling. The idea that if you can bring together decision makers to look in the whites of the eyes of the people they're trying to serve through things like user testing and ethnographic research, then that's a way to actually build support for your service. Honey evoked the wisdom of the ancient Greeks in her talk, and I will do the same in my conclusion. Pathos is stronger than logos, which is to say that the emotional appeals are often stronger than the logic-based ones. And therefore, if you get stuck in a government digital transformation project, try to go back to what user-centered design can do in terms of building empathy for your users. Thank you very much. I don't think we have time for questions, do we? I have no idea what time it is. 2 minutes, yes. All right, I'll bring Honey back. Any questions from the audience? We also have another session downstairs after where you're free to ask as many questions as you'd like, or ask Honey for all the dirt. All right, well, obviously our talk was so comprehensive and answered every question. You're welcome, everyone.
Okay.
All right, I'm Katherine. It was really nice to speak with you all.
Okay, same, Honey Dacanay. Hit me up on Twitter or by email or see me in person while I'm here today.
Thanks very much.
Totally. It's like a security blanket. I don't even work for the government.